no intellectual, Washington read men the way others read books. As a young soldier called to the defense of his colony, he saw the darker side of human nature, the skulking militia, thieving speculators, and sunshine patriots who fought the French and Indians with their tongues. More galling still, he had to endure the condescension of Britain's military establishment toward the irregular colonials, who refused to dress or fight according to the time-honored ways of the old world. Early in the Revolution, the commanding general was forever devising brash tactics that worked better on paper than in practice. As he grew in confidence, Washington came to understand the conflict as a test of political more than military endurance. And while he might lament missed opportunities, he played the fox more often than the lion. In fact, he only fought 9 major battles in the Revolution. He lost more than he won. His genius was not for winning pitched battles in conventional lines. His genius was for inspiring men to hang on. It was perseverance. In the process, his insights into his fellow men deepened. "We must make the best of mankind as they are," he once declared, "since we cannot have them as we wish." Practical. George Washington harbored none of the modern reformers' illusions about human perfectibility. "Men may speculate as they will," he wrote at a bleak moment in continental affairs. "They may talk of patriotism. They may draw a few examples from current story. But who builds upon it as a sufficient basis for conducting a long and bloody war will find themselves deceived in the end. For a time, it may of itself push men to action, to bear much, to encounter difficulties, but it will not endure unassisted by interest." Washington did not fear interest. Far from it. For what else but interest had led him to amass vast land holdings, not always through the nicest of methods, or pursue youthful fame and adult fortune with an ardor that would put 21st century candidates for office to shame. He was an extraordinarily ambitious man. Classic, he was the most American. Oddly, for some who seems so remote for him, he is so much one of us, because as a young man he wanted very much to be rich, he wanted to be famous, he wanted to enjoy prestige and status. He achieved all of those things. None of them made him happy, and that is very American too. There were interests he learned greater than self-interest, and that is also very American. Causes nobler than personal enrichment. Over time, private gain took a backseat to Washington's campaign for nationhood, a campaign rooted in the radical idea that ordinary men and women could be entrusted to govern themselves. They could, that is, if they embraced public virtue. For Washington, so self-conscious about the figure he cut, it was not enough to be virtuous. He must appear to be virtuous. After the Revolution, he turned down grants of land and rejected out of hand an effort by Pennsylvania officials to petition the Continental Congress for money on his behalf. He agonized over whether to accept a gift of 150 shares in a Virginia Canal Company, voted him by a grateful Virginia Assembly. He was equally torn over attending the Constitutional Convention. After all, in returning his commission at the end of the Revolution, he had pledged to retire from public life. On the other hand, he was even more passionate about the success of Republican with a small r government than he was about the usefulness of canals. And he was not happy with the feeble regime governing, if you can call it that, under the Articles of Confederation. It really wasn't a government. If you look at the Articles of Confederation, it talks about a league of states. It couldn't levy taxes. It couldn't take military action. There really wasn't very much it could do. The Confederation appears to me to be little more than a shadow without a substance, Washington complained. "We are either a united people or we are not," he told James Madison in 1785. "If we are not, let us no longer act a farce by pretending to be." He had personal as well as political reasons to hold back. To his surrogate son Lafayette, Washington wrote, "I am not only retired from all public employment, but I am retiring into myself." The Washingtons were a short-lived breed, and in his mid-50s, the general regarded himself as living on borrowed time. In fact, the Washington men, few of them lived beyond 40. That wasn't all. More happiness was to be found, said Washington, quote, in the sequestered walks of connubial life, a rather convoluted way of saying marriage, than in the giddy rounds of promiscuous pleasure. I don't have to interpret that. Or the more tumultuous and imposing scenes of successful ambition. In public, protocol had forced him to walk a narrow line between aloofness and accessibility. At Mount Vernon, the place he loved most in all the world, Washington could relax his guard without lowering his standards. Formal dress gave way to buckskin breeches and tall boots. My manner of living is plain, he wrote soon after the Revolution, when the house became, in the sardonic words of its owner, a well-resorted tavern. A glass of wine and a bit of mutton are always welcome. Those who expect more will be disappointed. In fact, Washington was overrun with visitors whose curiosity was their ticket of admission. We know from his diaries that one year, for example, he and Martha welcomed 600 guests in the course of a year, most of whom were perfect strangers. That's why if you go to Mount Vernon today, you'll see two houses. You'll see the old house. And then after the Revolution, Washington built on a wing with the public rooms and another wing with the very private rooms, including a new bedroom for he and Martha and his study. And basically, there's no connecting between the two. This was a man who lived a compartmentalized life long before that term became popular. At Mount Vernon, Washington gave free rein to his talent for innovation. He abandoned tobacco for wheat. He invented a plow to break the crumbly red soil. He scooped out mud from the Potomac with which to fertilize his fields. He was a self-taught architect. He mixed sand with fresh paint to make his wooden house look like stone. He was an inveterate lover of gadgets who delighted in a tin shower bath, a washstand that doubled as a card table, and a fan chair whose pedals let him shoo away flies. The new nation envisioned in the unratified Constitution reflected both his inventiveness and his practicality. Still, it was with considerable reluctance that he had consented to join 54 other delegates summoned to Philadelphia in the summer of 1787. And even by the standards of the day, this is not a representative bunch. 55 white men, needless to say, no African Americans, no women, overwhelmingly Protestants, plantation owners, lawyers, the governing class. The genius of the founders was that they created a constitution and a system that could, over time, become more representative, could, with the right leadership, become more reflective, more truly democratic than the generation that created it. Washington arrived in Philadelphia fully aware of his symbolic importance to a nation that was more conceptual than real. His mere presence at the Pennsylvania State House elevated a gathering whose product might otherwise have gone out to the world a political orphan. Nor was it lost on his colleagues that their presiding officer, who had already, in effect, been president of the colonies, exercising administrative, diplomatic, and political sovereignty throughout 8 years of war, would almost certainly fill the as yet undefined role of executive, if, big if he could be persuaded to risk a jealously guarded reputation. At the convention itself, Washington presided in majestic silence. He only spoke once, as delegates debated a government that would almost certainly be entrusted to his care. His Virginia neighbor, George Mason, argued for a multiple executive and an advisory council of state to delegate and disperse authority. Think how history would have been different if Mason had had his way. To Mason, the proposed presidency, held by one man, was in fact an elective monarchy. He was not alone in his objections. Thomas Jefferson disliked the provision allowing for re-election at the end of 4 years. James Monroe criticized the Electoral College. Small wonder, then, that Alexander Hamilton should use the word indispensable to describe Washington as the only man in America who could calm the fears of such critics and give legitimacy to the experiment.